Yeah. All right, we're back to it. Sharing. Okay. So my thought process is the autonomic nervous system. I have just a few things I want to touch on from this slide set, and then I would like to move into digestion. I have a digestion PowerPoint and a regulatory substances of the gut PowerPoint. They're relatively short, so I think we can probably get through them all in this next hour, but we'll see how we do. If not, we'll bleed into the last. Alrighty. Any other like questions, thoughts, concerns from the previous neurology stuff? And you should recognize the physiology. Obviously, there's so much neurophys. There's so much, all these things. There's way more topics than what I'm covering. I'm just trying to give you the highest yield physiology content that you, at least, again, these are things you should know going into the test. Anything extra is bonus, right? Anything extra physiology based. We'll do path next week and the week after. So we have not talked about path yet. Immuno, micro, or biochem. Okay, so autonomic nervous system. Oh, there you go. Oh. I do start referencing in these PowerPoints. Sorry, it's trying to play a video. Maybe I don't in this one. But in some of them, if you ever see me reference a like question in the study guide, it is related to the 2022 study guide for NPLEX that's posted. So you can reference it onto that study guide that you have. And like I mentioned yesterday, we can talk about the 2023 one. I have compared them. They're really no different. So I don't think there's really a lot of change from 2022 to 2023. So organization of your autonomic nervous system, recognize the differences between your sympathetic and parasympathetic. So this comes to structure. So the ganglia, the cluster of neurons in the peripheral nervous system for sympathetic is right next to the spinal cord versus the parasympathetic, it's closer to the actual effector tissue. Sympathetic neurons and ganglia come off of the thoracolumbar spine versus parasympathetic is the cranial nerves and sacrum. And then because that ganglia location, the sympathetic nervous system has short pre-ganglionic fibers and long post, and parasympathetic is opposite. And that's just based off of the ganglia location. So if you remember the ganglia location and where it's coming from, you don't have to memorize these two things because the ganglia location will tell you which cord, the pre or post, is longer than the other. The sympathetic nervous system, this is what I'm talking about when I talk about the sympathetic chain ganglia or the sympathetic cord. So in red here, this is our sympathetic nerves or neurons or axons. The neurons are represented by these little white circle that's tiny. The axon is represented by the red, and then it's going to synapse in this sympathetic chain, and then it's going to terminate in the actual effector organs. So the preganglionic neurons are red, the postganglionic neurons are black. It can move a signal from this point in the spinal cord, can move up and down this chain wherever it wants to go. So it does not have to synapse right at the same spinal location, which is how you're able to have things synapse up top in the cervicals and down low in the sacrum. Okay, so even though they're originating from the thoracolumbar space, they can synapse anywhere along this sympathetic chain ganglia, collection of neuron cell bodies, and then they can affect all these different organs that are listed on this screen. Yes. Yeah, the chain is right next to the spinal column on either side. Yep, so it's right next to, so in this instance, we're looking at the body from the side and we're seeing this sympathetic chain. This is the collection of neuron cell bodies and then the axons that are connecting it. So it's a cluster. If you think about having a lot of neurons together, all those axons then are typically collected in bundles, and those bundles are called nerves, right? So it's just essentially a big bundle of neuron cell bodies and nerves right next to the spinal column, spinal cord, outside the vertebra. It's outside of the vertebra, not inside the vertebra. So if you had damage to an area of your back or spinal column or vertebra, could it affect the sympathetic nervous system? It could affect those ganglia because they're located super close to the spinal cord, the spinal column. Your parasympathetic will see this ganglionic chain is located much closer to the effector organs. And it's not one chain then, right? It's not all kind of interconnected. Yes. Yeah, so the only things that are coming off, good question. So the only things that are actually coming off spine for the sympathetic chain, this is only sympathetic, this picture. It doesn't have the parasympathetic on it. The parasympathetic picture, I'll show it later. I don't have a picture yet, later on in the slide. So the preganglionic cell bodies are only coming off from here to here. That's the red, the example of these red lines. Those are all preganglionic neurons. The black lines that you're seeing, those are all postganglionic neurons. And I know you can't see that because this is in the way, but the black is all the postganglionic. So anything that's kind of traveling over here, that's representing a postganglionic neuron synapsing with its effector organ. Yeah. And if there's lines that don't go to anything, then those are not actually neurons that are synapsing with anything, right? It shows those synapses here. That's communicating where they're synapsing. These ones are like synapsing with, this is not, these are synapsing with nothing, essentially. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So if we go here and we actually look, and we're going to look at this picture a little bit closer. So I'm going to say we're going to look at this picture on the next slide. So if we go into the actual spinal cord then, and we look at the preganglionic neuron, so presynaptic neuron. This is our spinal cord. This is the gray matter, these areas that's kind of darker pink, and this is our white matter. The preganglionic or the synapse is going to essentially start in our gray matter in this lateral horn here. We can't see it represented here in this lateral horn. It's then going to travel through the ventral root, and it's going to travel around until it has its first option to synapse, which it can synapse either right in this chain, it can synapse at a different level of the chain, or it can synapse in a peripheral ganglia. So sometimes will. Those are the preganglionic neurons. So the preganglionic neurons are traveling from the gray matter of the spinal cord, that lateral horn, through the ventral roots, and they're going to synapse in that chain of ganglia or in a peripheral ganglia. From there, to get to the gray rami, our postganglionic neuron, so I'll represent as green, our postganglionic neuron, once it is traveling, if it synapses, whenever it's synapsing in that sympathetic chain, it's going to travel through the gray ramus or through the gray rami, which is the connector from the sympathetic chain back to spinal nerves, where it's then going to travel into the periphery. So that's the gray ramus or gray rami. It's the essentially connector point from the sympathetic chain to the spinal nerve, which then allows for that postsynaptic axon or postsynaptic nerve to travel to its effector organ. Does that help? Okay. We can see this here in the same kind of picture here. We can see the ventral root. It's traveling, it's synapsing in the chain, and then it's traveling through the gray ramus, the gray rami, and connecting back to that peripheral nerve. The white ramus, if it travels through this pathway, is what takes it towards the sympathetic chain. The gray ramus or gray rami is what takes it away from that sympathetic chain. It originates in gray matter in the spinal cord, because neuron cell body, right? So gray matter, neuron cell body in the spinal cord. That's where our neuron is going to originate. The neuron represented as the white little bubble. This picture also shows our sympathetic, our sensory neurons, which is why it can get confusing, because we see this other color of things here. So the green actually in this picture is your sensory neuron. So this is a sensory ending we're affecting the gut. That's our effector organ. The sensory ending here is sending a sensory signal. If we're talking about the gut, it's probably a visceral sensory nerve. So it's sending the signal up through the white rami. And that's why we heard the right rami before, because it's going through the right rami to the spinal nerve, and it's going to potentially synapse and go into the spinal cord via the dorsal root. So sensory enters into the dorsal root. Motor typically exits out the ventral roots of the spinal cord. White rami is for traveling, sensory is traveling through the white rami towards the spinal cord. White rami can also be used for the motor neuron to travel out to the sympathetic chain. Gray rami is used as the connector for our sympathetic chain back to the spinal nerves. What I'd encourage you to do is just look at this picture and follow the tracks. That's how I learned it. and how I think it's best stated, and then write it in words because you won't have the image, right? So you have to write it out in word verbiage because that's what they'll say. They'll say white ramus, gray ramus, or white rami, gray rami, ventral root, dorsal root. That's when people get confused. Okay. Other important pieces of sympathetic function. Sympathetic nerves release norepinephrine at their nerve endings. These are adrenergic nerves. These are going to be the postganglionic sympathetic nerves. All preganglionic sympathetic nerves release acetylcholine. So if we leave the spinal cord, these preganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine at their initial synapse. That's then going to synapse. It's going to send a signal to their postganglionic neurons, which they will release norepinephrine at their end organ, their effector organ. So all postganglionic sympathetic nerves release norepinephrine, and therefore they are called adrenergic nerves. All preganglionic sympathetic nerves release acetylcholine, and we will see other things that release acetylcholine as well here coming up. The ones that are different: sweat glands, piloerector muscles, goosebumps, and certain blood vessels do not have norepinephrine release. They will have acetylcholine. The one that's tested on the most on NPLEX is sweat glands. So remember, sympathetic stimulation of sweat glands is from acetylcholine, not norepinephrine. Everything else is norepinephrine, the effector muscle. To get norepinephrine, remember we do tyrosine to dopa, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. This biochemical pathway is important to note. Acetylcholine, on the other hand, is a combination of acetyl-CoA, yes, that acetyl-CoA that's used in our Krebs cycle, and choline. Our sympathetic nervous system receptors are going to be alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. Remember, we had adrenergic nerves releasing norepinephrine. Norepinephrine binds to alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. Alpha receptors are typically located on blood vessels. If we had to generalize, they're located elsewhere, but we'll generalize as blood vessels being a major component, leading to vasoconstriction. Beta receptors can be divided into beta 1 and beta 2. Beta 1 is going to it's going to be heart specific, increasing heart rate and contractility. Beta 2 is going to be full tissue specific, so bronchial dilation, dilation of blood vessels and skeletal muscles, caloriogenesis, glycogenolysis. We're trying to run from the bear. We're trying to get quick sugar to our skeletal muscles. We're trying to restrict blood flow to our organs of digestion and organs of reproduction. So that's why we have vasoconstriction from our alpha. These are to blood vessels that are going to places that we don't want to have excess blood, that we don't need to use right now. And we have vasodilation to our skeletal muscles, because we want to make sure our skeletal muscles have the energy to be able to run away from said bear or animal or thing. Okay. This is probably your best summary slide. So I would say if I was going to learn one slide, I'd learn this slide, because this talks about your sympathetic stimulation, your traditional autonomic nervous system, and then how it stimulates the adrenal medulla. Because remember, the adrenal medulla also is going to secrete, actually, sorry, this is adrenal medulla. This is your typical secretion. Your adrenal medulla is also going to secrete norepinephrine and epinephrine, but directly into the bloodstream as a hormone. Versus this is going to be your traditional autonomic nervous system pathway. Okay. These videos are crash course. If you're really struggling with neuro, crash course, it tends to be a little bit more simplistic for what you need in medical school, but it can be a great launching pad. And I think their neurologic lectures actually do a pretty good job. So if you're wanting some video content, I encourage crash course A&P for the neuro stuff. For parasympathetic, I just want to go through the differences. So parasympathetic, we're coming off of the cranial. So our cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and then our sacrum. Okay. So cranial nerves are going to be the majority of our body that's stimulated, really, like all through here. And then our sacral nerves is really the things that are real down low, close to the sacrum, our anal sphincter, our detrusor, the bladder stuff, and our genitalia. That's really what your sacral parasympathetic nervous system nerves are controlling. Everything else is those 3 cranial nerves. And the majority, if you can tell here, is going to be your vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. So your parasympathetic nerves that are coming off your cranial nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10. Your oculomotor nerve, it's going to provide fibers to pupillary sphincters and the ciliary muscle. So eye movement. Your facial nerve, and as well, really actually going to be focusing on, so the autonomic function will be your glands, right? Facial nerve we think about as facial movement, but the autonomic function is the gland secretion. Glossopharyngeal, your parotid gland, and then vagus, all of your visceral organs. All of your parasympathetic nerves secrete or release acetylcholine. Easy peasy. All of them, therefore, are called cholinergic nerves. So nerves that release acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter, we can call cholinergic nerves. That means our presynaptic sympathetic nerve is also a cholinergic nerve. Because our presynaptic sympathetic nerve or our preganglionic sympathetic nerve releases acetylcholine. Our postganglionic sympathetic nerve releases norepinephrine, so it's adrenergic. In the parasympathetic nervous system, everything releases acetylcholine, so it's all cholinergic. It's great. We have two different receptors, though, that it's binding to, nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. They both bind to acetylcholine. Nicotinic receptors are on synapses between pre- and post-ganglionic neurons and at the neuromuscular junction. So in the somatic nervous system, nicotinic receptors are binding to acetylcholine for your muscle contraction. In the autonomic nervous system, nicotinic receptors are located between the pre- and postsynaptic ganglia or pre- and postsynaptic neurons always for parasympathetic and sympathetic because both are using acetylcholine. Where they differ is at their end terminus when they're actually responding or providing the information, the input to the organ. At the parasympathetic system, there's going to be a muscarinic receptor at that end organ space, at that end terminus, at that organ, that's going to respond to acetylcholine. For the sympathetic nervous system, it's our adrenergic receptors, either alpha or beta. So that's the big difference. Being able to differentiate what's the same and what's different between these two, drawing it out can be very helpful on a test so you don't get confused. But there's a lot of great test questions that can be pulled from this process of neurotransmission in the autonomics. Yeah. Yes. Sweat glands will be a muscarinic receptor responding to acetylcholine. Correct. Excellent. And that is the one difference of the sympathetic nervous system. Good. Excellent. Excellent. Okay. I think that's what I have here that I wanted to talk about. Those are my main pieces. Discard. Yeah, this gets into the control, like what it does to each organ in the body, which is great to know. But really, I want you to go through that. Okay, perfect. So we are going to go into digestion. Yeah, so we're going to do digestion. We're going to start with the digestion PowerPoint, and then we'll go into regulation. Or do I want to switch that? Yeah, we'll do digestion first. So we're going to go through this digestion PowerPoint, and then we'll do regulation. Some of this stuff for the digestion PowerPoint we'll move through actually relatively fast. So moving into our gut here next. Before I move on, is there anything that we covered in the nervous system that you're still not quite feeling great about? Yes. Correct. Your somatic is different than your autonomic. So I'd separate the two. So somatic, autonomic, different. They're both going to be motor, right? Somatic is going to be your conscious control, your voluntary control, your skeletal system. Autonomic is your involuntary control, and it's going to be your parasympathetic and sympathetic. So your somatic, if we, I was like, do I have a, I don't know if I have a whiteboard marker. Right here. So your somatic, it's just going to have a cell body, one long axon, and it's going to synapse at your muscle tissue, it's going to be acetylcholine that's released. And did I say nicotinic receptor? Yeah, always nicotinic. Nicotinic receptor. That's your somatic. So it's simple. There's not two, only one receptor type, only one neurotransmitter. And this is always going to be stimulatory or excitatory. Anytime we send an action potential down an axon for the somatic nervous system, we're always wanting to activate the muscle, right? We're saying we want to move our bicep. We want to walk and move our body. We want to kick our leg, whatever you're trying to do. It's a voluntary control. So you're trying to actually do it. So it's always going to be stimulatory. That's the big difference between this and the autonomic. Okay. Other questions about the nervous system? It's a good one. It's all skeletal. Yep, all skeletal. Always going to be skeletal muscle, not smooth, not cardiac. Yep. I saw Danielle's hand first, and then yeah. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Totally. Let's pull it up. It'll be easier if I have a picture. There. Okay. So we have spinal cord. We chop it. We have our lateral horn. That's where they're coming out of. But we don't care about all this. We're focused right now on our rami. So let me get into this. Here we go. Okay. White rami. We can see there's two things that will run through it. We're going to have our sensory nerve that's moving towards, or our afferent nerve, our afferent sensory signal that's going towards the spinal cord will move through the white rami. The other thing that will be moving through the white rami is going to be our efferent signal of our autonomic nervous system. This efferent signal is going to be moving through the white rami to this sympathetic chain ganglia. So those are the two things that can move through our white rami, one towards, one away. Our gray rami, on the other hand, okay, here, we see we're going to have, again, an efferent nerve, often a postsynaptic, at least in this case, postsynaptic nerve, running from our sympathetic chain, connecting back into our spinal nerve. So our gray rami, we see our efferent nerve as a part of the autonomic nervous system, moving away from the chain ganglia and into its spinal nerve. That's our gray rami. So white has more of that, of more things than gray rami. White rami tends to look more white also because they're myelinated often. Gray can be myelinated or unmyelinated. Does that help? Ventral root, dorsal root, ventral root. We see our motor system exit. Dorsal root, we see our sensory system come in. Or you could say ventral root, we have efferent fibers. Dorsal root, we have afferent fibers. You could see them stated either way. There probably will be a question involving these, and then there's sometimes a question involving these, less common. Dorsal and ventral root, those are often thrown around in NPLEX questions. Sometimes maybe even just as a detractor. Anything else? Yes.
Is there a reason why on both pictures differentiate as sympathetic spinal?
Yes, that's great. Excellent question. I'm glad you brought that up. So the question was, is there a reason why on both pictures the cervical spine wasn't included, the parasympathetic and sympathetic? Yes, the cervical spine does not have any nerve roots that are part of the autonomic nervous system. The cervical spine roots go towards what? What do some of the cervical spine roots go towards? Somatic, brachial plexus, somatic nervous system. So we do not have any cervical spine roots that are a part of the autonomic nervous system. There's no autonomic nerves that come out of the cervical spine. Another great test question. Because they'll put cervical, craniosacral, lumbo-cervical, they'll try to combine all these things. The nerve roots or the nerves that exit that are part of the sympathetic nervous system are thoracolumbar, from the thoracic and the lumbar region. The nerves for the parasympathetic are cranial from the brain stem and sacral. There are no nerves that are part of the autonomic nervous system from the cervical spine. Those are all part of the somatic nervous system if they exit from there.
Probably like the injuries, they still digest all those things.
But you couldn't, you might have paralysis or numbness or tingling or things like that. Yeah. You could have issues with sensory, right? Sensory can still come through there. So your sensations may be affected, but your autonomic nervous system won't be affected from a cervical spine injury directly. Unless it chops your spinal cord, then obviously that would cause everything down to have a problem. But like compression of those nerve roots wouldn't affect digestion. Cool. Good stuff. I love that. I love me some autonomic nervous system in the morning. Okay. Great. I know a lot of you just finished the digestion or the GI. Oh, let me actually, I'm gonna